Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report this week. You just missed some very esoteric off air conversations that we hope to at least translate
Mhm.
just a bit of for you. Now, moving into this, following up on some of the stories that we had covered on our Wednesday episode, which we did record on Tuesday night, just for context. Moldova and Transnistria seems to be the next big staging ground for this conflict. And I suppose it really is just a sign of desperation by the Ukrainian government that they want to crush this just sliver of a state, or so called state, or breakaway region, if we're being generous, out of Moldova, which, again, Moldova has been one of those countries that's really walked this tightrope between the West and Russia, has had its color revolutions, has had its election results overturned. The usual nonsense that happens in these Eastern European nations post Soviet Union. And with that being said, what you see there is you have Romanian forces debating going into Moldova. You have the Moldovan forces activated. Now, I wasn't really able to decipher because I saw reports of both. Now, of course, there is a lot to parse through with that, whether the Moldovan forces were just activated for their own territorial sovereignty, whether they feared so called Russian aggression, or whether they were actually taking a more aggressive stance against Ukraine intervening in its internal conflict. And once again, even from the perspective of NATO and Ukrainian elite desperation, I really can't see the motivation to move into Transnistria. It's not exactly a really valuable wedge for Russia. Now, of course, it's a pro Russian aligned region that wants to break away from Moldova. And much like other things that start with that prefix, let's just say it will never be a real country. But with that out of the way, uh, I don't know what the big fear is, like whether they expect Russia to completely engulf southeastern Ukraine and link up with Transnistria. I know it was a fear during the initial invasion that they would move forces in from the west because Russia does have peacekeepers there. But really, I suppose we're just here to speculate about it, unless you have any a more solid explanation that I can come up with. Because just looking at this, there's really no rationale I can see behind this move at this time, even from a cynical pro NATO or we need to please our foreign donor perspective. Again, crushing Transnistria doesn't seem like that pertinent of a goal for the West. Is it something they really fear is going to cause a European-wide revolution? And speaking of European-wide revolution, we'll get in some of the wishy-washiness with the gas embargoes and the sanctions and whatnot. We do have some news about uh, Georgia in particular was one of them, but just Europe in general with the current embargoes. But just going forward, just to preface this, we are going to treat this as a bit more of a supplementary episode. So if it's a bit shorter, a bit less detail, that's what you're getting into right now because we already did put out the show this week. We just wanted to tie up a few loose ends, cover a few bases that we didn't
Yeah.
necessarily get to over the course of the main show this week. But if you have any theories on this Transnistria debacle, I'm all ears.
Yeah, I mean, I have some long and short-term root causes as to why this might happen. And oh, long about a day or two before Zelensky, or at least his administration, announced that they might go in, uh, and it's that guy Arestovich, and sometimes this guy runs his mouth honestly. Um, with in complete um, contradistinction to whatever Zelensky is saying. He's the guy who was saying that Ukraine is like the forces are finished, and yet he does this video. He goes, "Yeah, I think it's worth going in. We could take over," and he snaps his fingers like that fast. However, I don't know if we mentioned on the show, but what the Russians had done is they had sent in one of their cruise missiles, and they'd blown out a bridge which was sending arms and oil into Ukraine. Romania was giving them arms, and Bulgaria was giving them oil. And today, Zelensky had said that we will have to do this because supplies have been extremely reduced. The shipment of supplies have been extremely reduced because of the blowing out of the bridge. And this is why, like, one of the command theories for American wars is that you take all this stuff out really early on, right? Power stations, bridges, roads, because that forces the enemy to have to rebuild all this stuff. Now, of course, Russia for the first 5 6 weeks didn't do any of this because I think they still wanted some kind of a deal. Um, I also think what they're doing is they're
Yes, and not to
establishing a kind
mention
of
they also fought the war under the pretense that this territory would be integrated into either a new third party state or into Russia proper. So they didn't want to have to spend the millions, if not billions, of dollars in reconstruction. Where, again, for example, America didn't have those intentions, say, in Serbia or Iraq or Afghanistan, where they could just break everything and leave it to the locals to fix because at the end of the day, beyond some reconstruction projects in order to secure their own occupation, in the case of Iraq and Afghanistan in particular, it's not exactly like they need to build first or even second world living standards for these people, just enough to maintain control.
yeah, that's true. But I think when you look at all the places where shipments were coming in Western Ukraine, all of that could have been taken out when they hit that NATO training center just west of Lviv. Um, the timing of that attack, I think, can lead people. I mean, we'll never know for sure. Um, is sort of my take on it, but I tend to think that it's not like they took out that bridge and they had taken out all the other bridges as well. It's been really, really gradual, and I guess the theory that this is an area that they want to keep or they wanted to go independent. I can understand leaving that uh, as as long as you have to, but then why begin to take out stuff in the sixth week of the war in areas that you probably don't intend to take over? I think it's not easy to really figure out what exactly the Russians want. I think that is an ever ongoing kind of development. Um, Even when a lot of people thought it was pointless to negotiate, they were still attempting to negotiate. But that's all done with now. I think after March 15th, 16th, it's over. So it's been over for quite a while. But be that as it may, so they took out the bridge, and this has made supplies getting into Ukraine ever more difficult. And that this is a real issue for Ukraine because whatever we'll hear about Ukrainians receiving, let's say even Leopard 1 tanks, the problem is they don't have spare parts. So you know military equipment breaks down even if it's not shelled, and there really isn't a way to repair these tanks for the most part.
Yeah, once again,
Uh,
just to point out, I know it's a cliche, but so much of warfare, especially in our modern age, is determined by logistical capabilities. Can you
yeah,
keep things supplied? Can you keep things maintained in order so they actually do operate? Because, again, we could send over the finest Abrams tanks we have, for example, to Ukraine, and if they don't have the ability to fuel and maintain these things, they're just target practice for Russia.
yeah, yeah, and in these coming weeks, it's obvious now that the Russians are figuring out ways to take out the Berkut or Bertak. Those Turkish drones. They're taking out quite a few of them. Um, just before we meander back to Moldova and Transnistria, it should be said, I think it was that day or a little or a few hours after that we recorded the show, I believe on Monday, that a drone was sent to another oil depot, but well within Russian territory, like 100 kilometers north of Kharkov, and that shocked a lot of people. It was a nighttime raid, um, and it worked. Um, is it going to change the outcome of the war or how the war is progressing right now? Not really. I don't think so. Just the amount of bullets that are necessary for this war is something else that has to be considered. But the question I think of Transnistria is that number one, it's a very easy region to take over if they wanted to. Now the Russians have, I believe, for like 3 brigades there, and in many ways, it's a precursor to the people in Donbass that except it happened much earlier when the Soviet Union fell. This was a portion of Moldova that refused to assimilate with the Moldovan population. Be that as it may, Moldova does have a sizable Russian, Slavic, Bulgarian, Ukrainian population, but the largest of the Slavic groups there that I mentioned are Russian. I think it's like 20, 25% maybe, but it's sizable. And the the prime minister of Moldova, I believe her name is like Simenu or Simu or anyhow, she is dead set against Romania coming in and uh, basically starting a war in ostensibly her country. The Ukrainians, I think, they're looking for diversions, and I think this is why I think maybe Transnistria might end up not being anything. I know there's lots of videos of columns of purportedly columns of Romanian troops moving to the front. We're supposed to presume they're going through Moldovan territory. But I think the atmosphere in Europe has really changed. From what I'm seeing of videos, the average person in Europe does not want this war to go on any longer than it has to. Now, that's an uh, contradistinction to their elites, who I think, for the most part, not all of them, but for the most part, are interested in keeping America happy to keep the war going as long as possible because this is the only path to overthrow Putin. It's the only path to destroy Russia is by turning it into a forever war.
Yes, and
Um,
on that same vein, with the reports about Romania and similar reports about Poland moving in to play peacekeeper, quote unquote, in parts of Western Ukraine, some are speculating that of course, heads of NATO and NATO countries are trying to find a way that will justify, if not outright conflict, ways to justify further involvement in said conflict, whether that be through the, again, so-called peacekeepers in Western Ukraine via Polish forces, or Romania getting involved in Moldova via Transnistria, which, of course, Romania being a NATO member, Transnistria being a allegedly Russian-backed breakaway state, and of course the Russians do have troops there. They have their own so-called peacekeepers there. Some are speculating that it is trying to intentionally heighten the tensions of the war. I'm not saying that's unreasonable, but I would have to see more of this play out before I could definitively say one way or another if that's the case.
right, and there have been three independent attacks that have spanned over like 3 days. Now, the last 48 hours, there have been no new attacks, but the first one that occurred, uh, there's video footage of it. It's just two or three guys that come out of a car and they have like little rocket launchers that they fire at this government building in Transnistria, and they literally just drop them after they fire them, and they get into the car, and the car speeds off. Then there was an attack on some kind of installation. I forget what it was, and then finally there was an attack with drones on a radio tower. Two ordinances were dropped, and it damaged the radio tower that's used for broadcasting. Maybe that was a selective attack. Maybe the Ukrainians are suspicious that this is coming in through the airwaves on radio. I don't know. Like maybe it's assisting the Russian forces in some way. Transnistria is very close to Odessa, at least the southern portion is. I mean, it is an act of desperation, I think, with the with the Ukrainians that they would go to Transnistria. We mentioned in the last show that they have this arguably, like, take it how you will, uh, this huge depot of ordinances and arms that are stored there. It's all Soviet era stuff, which they use. But the problem is it could mean it's like between 42 to um, 29, 30 years old equipment. I'm not a military expert, but I would imagine some of that might be dangerous to try to use, like maybe some mortar shells won't behave properly. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm
I
no
do think
armaments
though.
expert, but I imagine those things need at least some degree of maintenance. I imagine that can only go so far. I do believe, for specific examples, you can look at some of the conflicts in the Middle East, say Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, where there have been malfunctions with this older military equipment that has resulted in what, for example, what you were referring to.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, even some of the Stinger missiles, which are like 20 years old, right? Even some of them are not firing correctly because they're very old. Um, but I think that, if you look at what Saakashvili, the former president of Georgia, was saying, he was ready to fly back to Georgia to open up a second front in Georgia until the prime minister there said, no, you're not going to do it. We are not going for a second war in Georgia. So I look at both these attempts as ways to spread Russia's attention in much the same way that maybe that's what Kazakhstan was about as well, hoping that that would not be something that would be resolved in 3, 4 days, but it would linger for 3 or 4 months. That didn't happen, but I always thought that in many ways that was something in anticipation of a conflict that would open up between Russia and Ukraine. Yeah, because obviously, right, if something like that happened in Kazakhstan, if it could not be resolved, a good portion of Russian men would have to be shipped over into Kazakhstan. They would be the primary force, and that means that the 60 to 80,000 that the Ukrainians had positioned between, let's say, December to January of 2021, 2022, could then steamroll into Donbass, right? So it was crucial that Kazakhstan didn't blow up into a second front. Um, so I think, if people are following this war closely, then you know that there are very steady gains that the Russians are producing at a daily level, and that the Ukrainians are taking some pretty heavy casualties. You've seen the Pentagon indicate this as much. Boris Johnson in India basically saying that Ukraine may lose this. Um, there is a sense also of communication that was intercepted with a lieutenant in Donbass on the Ukrainian side, and saying that the situation is bleak. They have had no rest. The shelling does not stop day or night. Uh, they've had no rest. Uh, you remember that there was a period where the Russians pulled out of the Kiev region in the north, and things kind of died down for about 3, 4, 5 days, and that gave a lot of the troops rest and time to repair. Uh, the technical military machinery that's involved in wars. Um, these guys have not had a break since the beginning of the war.
And honestly, if you want to know how bad it is, I saw some news today that the writers finally decided to retire the Ghost of Kiev character. They
You're
officially
kidding.
they no
I
no
didn't
I
even.
saw this. I think it was New York Post where they officially wrote up that he had been KIA, killed in action, and uh, I guess the narrative was just getting so weak they just needed just have him go out in a blaze of glory. That's what they said. Of course, he is there for the first week or so of the war. suddenly disappears after this great flying record, and now all of a sudden it turns out that he has been felled by the greatest. Now, for those of you up on your Ace Combat lore, I guess that means Soul Squadron must have got him, but that's that's aside the point. I need to stop making those references. They're too obscure for most of you to probably get, but I would certainly recommend, just on a side note, the Ace Combat games are some of the best I've played recently. But
Oh,
with that out of the way, I saw some interesting, very reliable reports from the British Defense Ministry that allegedly Russia will be declaring war and a general mobilization during the May 9th Victory Day parade. And I don't believe it for a second, but I figured it's worth bringing to the floor for speculation. I doubt you believe any of it either, but I figure it's worth throwing out there the fact that they're really trying to drum up the idea that Russia's just going to unleash the hordes upon Ukraine and overrun the country and just declare total war after waiting, let's see, by that point it would be 2.5, almost 3 months of conflict to actually move into a general mobilization as if this were the primary war effort, as if war against all these NATO states had broken out, as if Article 5 had been invoked, as if they
hmm
again needed to fight another intercontinental war. Now, again, I simply don't see that. Maybe they will move into an official state of war. I'm not ruling out that possibility. I don't think it's going to happen. But I have a hard time believing that Russia's going to go into a full wartime mobilization, which would presumably entail the addition of a wartime economy. And I know that due to the sanctions and due to the embargoes, Russia has been making a lot of, let's just say, drastic economic moves to keep up with that and to restructure it for, let's just say, a changing world order, as it were. But, and I'm no economic expert, none of those really seem to point to what would consider a move towards a wartime economy, which would focus on mass output of heavy industry. Now, correct me
yeah,
if I'm wrong. Correct me if I've overlooked anything, either you or the audience, that is. But I simply don't see where that has happened.
yeah. No, I don't either. And also, I think people get a lot of things confused about this war. I know in the preamble to the invasion, we were stressing, um, which areas of Ukraine would not want, definitely not want, Ukrainian Russian forces to be there. We were talking about how expensive it would be, um, and so on and so on. And after the war started, I said all those realities are still there. They're not gone because the war has started. In fact, they'll be exacerbated. And just because Russia went in quickly around the Kiev region in order to put pressure on Zelensky to quickly capitulate, does not mean that they had secret intentions all along to take over the entirety of Ukraine. I don't buy that. Um, what it did do is it froze those troops who are still reluctant to leave Kiev, and it made getting that whole swath of southern Ukraine that connects with Mariupol very quickly, very quickly. And Kherson is going to have a referendum in a few days. I think it's this weekend. I think they're supposed to decide in May. The people are already getting their pensions and rubles now. So it did, obviously, the Russians aren't totally forthright, but this was a region that I think they decided would be theirs, because I think they made some mistakes along the way, particularly in Kiev. Uh, One of the reasons why there was a massacre was because some of the locals did like them and did trade with them, and they did not announce that they were leaving, but all those people were instant targets after they left, and they paid with their lives for it. The least that they should have done is provided buses and had gotten out. I mean, their homes and everything would probably have been looted and destroyed, and or just taken over. Some of them had farm animals that they couldn't just abandon. But that was an enormous mistake, right? Because as we've said so many times, there's no way 40,000 is going to take care of this huge region stretching from the border further north into Russia down to Irpin and Bucha and all these other areas. You can't do it. It's not possible. And when I saw that they never increased the amount of troops there, it was obvious that I don't know, it's just some kind of a holding force. Even the airport, the Berispol, um, like why not? I always found that weird. Why aren't you increasing the amount of troops? I don't know. Maybe it was they felt there would never be enough public support. I don't know, but they didn't do that. And Kherson, in a way, they have to now. They own it whether they want it or not. And the soldiers are very happy about it. But if they leave, there will be a bloodbath. Um, uh, that that's how dangerous it is. All those people will be executed. There was even a blogger that a few weeks ago that was killed in his car. So there are people that are still roaming about, and they wait for an opportunity to eliminate somebody that is considered a collaborator. Um, but just to get back to Transnistria, Transnistria, if people don't know, is this very thin stretch of land wedged between Moldova and Ukraine. And I mean, it would be very easy to instantly surround some of these areas by massing enormous amount of troops there. Now, the question that has to be asked is, does Ukraine at this moment have the ability to do it? Right now, I would say it's possible, but it's not optimal. I think they're waiting for more armaments because, frankly, they don't have armor anymore, and they don't have enough gasoline to really be a mobile unit. If they took over Transnistria, it would have to be light regiments, almost like scouting regiments, like a heavier form of scouting regiments with manpads and all those sorts of things. What would the Russians do? I don't know. Like, if the Russians ignore that area, it's a face losing moment.
And there's also the question of what Moldova itself would do, seeing as Transnistria is official Moldovan territory. As we mentioned, Moldova's government is on that tightrope between Russia
Hmm.
and the EU, or the West, as it were.
Yeah.
And we could see a scenario where, of course, Moldova is more sympathetic to the pro Russian forces and maneuvers, whether that be militarily or diplomatically, to get Ukraine not to attack what is technically part of their territory, or the scenario where Moldovan forces cooperate with the Ukrainians, which I see the Moldovan forces wanting to keep their country out of this as much as possible, so I imagine they would do whatever they can to keep Ukrainian forces out of attacking Transnistria, despite the fact that it is a breakaway region. Or the most drastic scenario is that NATO troops, which would mainly be Romanian looking at the scenario, are actually in Moldova and are actually working on this surrounding method with, say, Ukraine. Now, I don't know if that's likely, but that's probably the most drastic possible scenario that it could be, having a NATO member being that close to Russian forces in that environment. But if I had to just take a guess out of all the, let's say, immediately possible options, I'd imagine Moldova is going to pull whatever strings it has, whatever influence it has with whoever, in order to keep Ukraine from intervening in its internal conflict, just for the sake of stability and order, relatively speaking.
Right. And I think Moldova's greatest fear is they know that tactile, technically, the Russians are not going to be able to reinforce that region right now. I mean, they could if they really had to, but it would. Um, I mean, they would have to bring in paratroopers. Uh, Everything would have to be dropped into that area. that could potentially make them targets. Uh, Ukraine right now does not have a lot of anti-air defense systems. In fact, two S-300s were taken out today, but they've been woefully short of them. And the fact of the matter is, what are they like? Can they rely on that? Is there an errant missile somewhere that is going to knock out a plane that is carrying hundreds of troops? Right, that would be devastating. Uh, would Russia let Transnistria fall? Let's say for the time being, uh, and accelerate their focus on Donbass.
Or there is also the question, depending on how Machiavellian Putin or the Russian military want to be, where maybe they do put, for example, a plane of paratroopers or equipment in an unfavorable position so they can, again, use that to maybe, again, re energize the population for the sake of the war. I'm not saying they would do that, but that is a possibility. Countries do these things in times of war where they will put, again, what either soldiers or civilians in a much more high risk situations, and if something happens they will use that to further their goals. So that could be something we're looking at. Now I don't know if Russia has the intention to escalate this war to, for example, a mobilized conflict, as I was saying earlier with the British intelligence or British Ministry of Defense alleged reports. I don't think they wanted to go that way, but uh, under a scenario they would, that could be a possibility, although I don't think that will happen. It is something that is possibly within the cards.
Right, and I mean the Russians are very serious about this. And as I said, I think Moldova is worried that Russia will not hesitate to take out certain targets, even well within Moldova instead of Transnistria proper. Uh, and Moldova is not a place that like has any substantial military of its own, and it's a very poor country. It's a country that was the poorest in Europe until Ukraine became the poorest country in Europe. And so it really can't afford this. Um, and then just this week, Guterres of the UN, after visiting Moscow and speaking with Putin, he went to Kiev, and Bulgaria's prime minister was also in Kiev. And as they were there, Russia launched two or three, definitely two, but I think it was actually three altogether, three missiles into Kiev, the city proper, that are believed to be like military command posts. There's been very little information that I've seen so far in Telegram indicating like, loss of life. There was another massive explosion in Kharkov. One civilian was killed. So I think Moldova is very worried about the war expanding there. But you could have hotheads in Romania who are like, well, so be it. It's hard to gauge. Like, you brought up earlier that the Poles uh, have irredentist wishes, to kind of take over Western Europe. And some of that has been substantiated because the Russian military has said um, that they've intercepted calls saying this as much, you know, to have like a portion of West Ukraine is similar to what Erdogan did in Syria, where he takes this swath of Syria and it's under de facto Turkish rule. Now, he's not moving Turks in there, as far as I know. And many of the towns and cities there have fighting and, you know, every now and then, not just Turkish paid insurgents, but actual Turkish soldiers get killed in these conflict zones that he's created. So the idea that Poland, as I said, might take this chunk out of West Ukraine has been substantiated because the Russian military branch has said that they've intercepted this call. But I would caution I would put some caution into that because if you remember, just about every time there were major troop movements, either the Russians doing it or NATO doing it in the Baltic states and Poland along Ukraine, right? People always said this could lead to an invasion, right? And I'm just saying that I think what the Russian command might be doing with its military intelligence is it might be preempting the possibility of that happening by announcing it, so that it doesn't happen, or by making this drill, because the Poles have already announced that they're going to do this drill where they go up and down the Polish border that is right next to the Ukrainian border. All right. So um, the reason that the Russians are doing it, it could be a preemption, it could be just to uh, bring attention that this is happening, is to poison the water, so to speak, right? It, that's what it's there for. Will they actually do it now? Rumor has it that the Americans have said that, if Poland wants to, they can, but the U.S. will not help them. So it will not be an Article 5 situation. Would America be happy with Poland doing this? I don't know. I don't know because the one country that's not being asked right now is Ukraine. I personally think the Ukrainians would become furious if Poland did that. Poland has the largest Ukrainian population in the world right now. If you read the Polish
In
news,
diaspora, that is.
yeah, in diaspora, right? If you read the Polish news, you have debates in their parliament suggesting that, there have to be more Ukrainian politicians to represent this new emerging public within Poland. There's already divisions within Polish civic life that are developing because of this issue.
And I know you can't put too much stock in what you see on social media, but I do remember there was some Ukrainian group, I think, that was actually in exile in Poland that was having a celebration of Bandera. And you
Yeah.
had Poles that were denouncing it because, of course, Bandera was also very anti Polish when it came to that
Oh yeah.
Galician region, which was very heavily disputed between all the ethnic groups living there at that time. And again, I pointed this out at the beginning of the conflict, not that I thought it was going to spill over into conflict anytime in the near future, that just because, say, Poles or people in the Baltic states or Slovaks, Czechs, Romanians, whatever, just because many of them may not like Russians, that doesn't absolve whatever
Yeah.
both historical and contemporary issues that they have with Ukraine and Ukrainians as well. And one of the other ones that was frequently discussed, especially with Orban being a Putin puppet, so called, was that Hungarian so called peacekeepers were going to move into areas with Hungarian populations in Ukraine. But
Right.
point being is, I do think, once again, and especially as these diaspora populations increase in these countries, that opinion toward Ukraine and Ukrainians may sour. And
Hmm.
it's also funny about the whole Polish thing because, yes, I agree the Ukrainians would be furious, but there were offhanded comments from Russian politicians, I think including Putin, somewhat co-signing one of these, that Poland and Russia should partition Ukraine again, or again, just
Yeah.
like these,
Yeah.
just and like Zhirinovsky, I think was also another big proponent
Yeah.
of that kind of stuff. Just saying like, and like Russian media always shows like these Ukraine partition maps, like this should go to Russia, this should go to Romania, this should go to Poland, whatever. But point being is that anti-Russian sentiment, as strong as it may be in many of these countries, only
Hmm.
goes so far. And we see that with the energy
Yeah.
issue, which we'll get into in a few minutes here. But I do think a lot of people have either forgotten or just weren't aware in the first place of the many outstanding both contemporary and historical issues that Ukrainians also have with their neighbors. Again, I mean, traditionally Europeans, let's just be honest, have not gotten along as people groups. There's a reason why war was so endemic in Europe up until 1945. I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing. Some of these wars were completely justified from one perspective or another, sometimes from both perspectives. Some of them that were just completely pointless wastes of life. Again, you have to judge each by its individual merits, time, whatever. But point being is, as we've also mentioned on previous shows, the post World War II era, especially, saw a lot of brutal, albeit, let's just say, uh, cleaning up of borders, and which has led, and of course, having Europe under an American occupation with integrated economies has helped. But the cleaning up of borders, making ethnic lines more solid, has also done a lot to prevent ethnic conflict. And when you have, of course, millions of people in diaspora fleeing into land that was, that they at least claim they have a historical tie to, for example, with some of these places in Poland and Slovakia, there are all these back and forth irredentist claims, which did somewhat calm down as the populations did homogenize. But once again, if you're pushing millions of diaspora into these territories, it's just that easy to get those types of conflict to flare up again.
Right. I think the whole thing about Poland taking over that area is, if it happens, I think it would have to be really meticulously planned out. Uh, there would have to be propaganda to prep the Ukrainian public for this, right? Because if it happens suddenly, I think this cooperation between Poland and Ukraine, and Poland, we know from all the NATO countries, with the exclusion of possibly the UK and America, are the most belligerent towards escalating this war. And the Poles remember massacres like Volyn, right? This area of Ukraine was predominantly Polish. And the Volyn, you can read up on it. The Ukrainians were particularly brutal. They killed children. Their whole idea was, only people who spoke Ukrainian and identified in Ukrainian could live in their territory. And that kind of extreme level and inability to cooperate with smaller groups within a country, um, has been from time to time a feature of Ukrainian nationalism. It is not a bug. It has been consistent. It has not always predominated, but it has always been there.
Yes, and one last
And
thing I'll mention about that in particular is I do think some of the analysis of this, and maybe even including some of ours, shows how much of a detachment a lot of people have from just history in general, where again, that fighting between Polish insurgents and Ukrainian insurgents under German rule happened, again, just 80 years ago. On a grand historical timeline, that's a drop in the bucket in terms of time when we're talking thousands upon thousands of years, or even just centuries in general. That's just a drop in the bucket. Where
right, right,
people find it inconceivable that in the 21st century, in the modern era, that you could have smaller allied forces at the behest of a larger empire, so to speak, start to turn on each other and fight against each other for their own interest or perceived interest. In which case, again, Poland hasn't moved into this land yet. Now, of course, the question of Ukrainian diaspora in Poland and surrounding countries, I do think will lead to many issues that will take years to resolve if a solid resolution even can be reached. But if you
yeah,
were to have
if
so
ever.
called Polish peacekeepers move into those areas that were historically ruled by Poland, again, you could get, dare I say, a repeat of what happened in 1941 and 1942 with an outright just ethnic war between Poles and Ukrainians in that area.
Right. And as I discussed last time, and actually a few shows back, I said, it could, even before the invasion, one of the things I said is Russia's aim is to make Ukraine a financial black hole for Europe and America, right? And then a few weeks ago, I made the statement about Kiev. Who knows? Maybe Kiev one day will fall into Russia's hands without even a war. Not that it would become necessarily Russian territory; it would have some autonomy, but it would do so, let's say, because economically, when this war ends, economically, it will be so devastating in Ukraine that Ukrainians themselves might have to fight with one another in order to determine what kind of future they're going to have. Because if it looks like America is going to discard Ukraine, and I personally don't think they will, not right away, unless other things go very badly. If the U.S. can sit on top of Afghanistan for 20 years, uh, they can do something comparable for Ukraine. But be that as it may, let's say the war ends. Ukraine no longer has uh, any enough men to really continue this war. Then there's the possibility of, because remember, Zelensky gets elected in order to bring the respect and the substantiation of the Minsk II agreement in peace with Russia, right? If things become even more chaotic and impoverished, and they will after the war ends, then you're going to have a conflict between Ukrainians. Ukrainians will have to decide, and it won't be just Russian-speaking Ukrainians versus Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians, or it won't be Russian minorities versus Ukrainian majorities.
Yeah, it'll
It will
become an
have to be
inter-ethnic
resolved,
conflict versus an intra-ethnic conflict.
right.
Or wait,
And so,
I got that backwards, but you guys get the point.
yes, so that is that's the potential, right? And I think the only way Ukraine would be able to reconcile Polish troops being quote unquote peacekeepers in Western Ukraine is if there was a contingent of various NATO aligned countries with them. It could not possibly be just Poland,
Especially
right?
Western aligned, because once again that gets in the question of their territorial disputes with Hungary or Romania or Slovakia, where again
Yeah.
they probably would have to pull from French, German, and British and even American ranks at that point in order to
Oh
have
yeah, they'd have to go
a
Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, countries that have less of a dog in the fight,
yeah,
literally.
yeah, the Mediterranean coalition to defend the territorial sovereignty of Ukraine. I'm sorry, but point being is like sending any Slavic or Eastern European troops is a recipe for disaster unless it's meticulously
Oh, it would
planned,
be.
or unless Poland is outright planning a complete ethnic cleansing campaign, which I don't see that. Maybe some of the more hardline nationalists in Poland would want something like that, but in terms of what is actually feasible, I do not see that happening.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, you I mean, you can see why it's in Poland's interest to work with Ukraine at this point, right? Because if you just look at the West Ukrainian problem, right? One of the things that the Russians did is they just deported many of the Poles all the way out into eastern or central Russia, right? Uh, there was an agreement with the Brits as well, that going forward, as you say, these countries would have to be, in fact, less diverse. And uh, so while that happened to Poles in Western Ukraine, which used to be part of Poland, uh, the same thing happened to Germans and other minorities that had to be removed
Yes,
from
millions of
Poland.
Germans being sent back to the either one of the two Germanys that were formed post World War II. And again, you just saw this mainly with Poles, Germans, and Ukrainians were the three groups that were predominantly affected by, let's just say, this ethnic redrawing, well as like smaller groups within the Soviet Union itself with internal deportations, as it were. I mean, but it did happen in other places in Europe as well between the world wars. For example, many Italians were expelled from what would later become part of Yugoslavia, whether it be from the Dalmatian Islands or Istria, or again, I believe it was Germans were also expelled from uh, Alsace-Lorraine after France reincorporated it post World War One.
Mhm.
But point being is there was a lot of border and outright ethnic redrawing where, again, under any other sort of circumstance, this would have been considered again ethnic cleansing. And I mean, I
Yeah.
think the redrawing of the Polish borders, moving their border however many you know dozens or hundreds of miles west, taking that much of what would be formerly known as East Prussia, incorporating what was historically Eastern Poland into Ukraine and Belarus as part of the Soviet Union. Where, again, I don't think people realize because the certain, let's just say, major atrocity of the 20th century overshadows all these things that happened within the same time frame. All the chaos that happened to various European peoples during and after World War II. And honestly, the most recent example we have of this, excluding this current war, was the, let's just say, porous borders of the South Slavic peoples. Of You saw this happen in
Yeah,
the 90s throughout Yugoslavia, where
yeah,
Croatians would be deported from Serbian territory, Serbs from Croatian territory,
yeah. The
Bosnians
Serbs
from
from
both, etc.
Slovenia, um, it's in the south, Slavonia. They were removed there. About 250,000.
Yes, but just these like redrawing of all these borders on ethnic lines, because after World War One, they tried like redrawing on ethnic lines. However, one could say the principal mistake they made there was if a group has a 50% majority, they get that. But for example, like you can have a 50% majority with you know two other groups that constitute like for let's just take a random region in Eastern Europe. Let's say it was 50% Polish with 25% Ukrainians and 25% Germans. Well, it's like you may have a solid majority there, but there's still two massive minority groups there, or even like in
Hmm.
some cases like a 51-49 split where again, you could like draw these ethnic lines, but that just accounted for the majority group there. Whereas after World War II, and we can discuss the merits of this, whether it was right or wrong. That's not the point. The point is that it happened and it created historical grievances. That there was mass population transfers all across Europe from 1945 onward.
Yeah, yeah. It's definitely the most unfortunate um, wars Europe has ever had.
And again, maybe my personal uh, bias is speaking here, and I imagine a lot of our audience would agree with this, but one could argue it was due to the degradation of Christian identity, whether that be Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox, where, again, you could have some degree of multi ethnic regions if there was a religion in common, because that was a greater unifying factor among people, and that's how a lot of these continental empires historically functioned, or some personal loyalty to whatever crown ruled over that land. But again, these, let's just say, supranational ideas throughout the 19th and 20th centuries were so degraded that really it came down between we're either going to have to do some very unpleasant things to draw clean borders, or we're going to have to live with perpetual internal conflicts.
Right, and there were some exceptions to that rule, with the Germans being divided, between Catholic and Protestant, um, and generally, the unification, or the creation of Germany out of many small, you know, German territories, or German states,
Yeah, and I
was a
think we
long
can once
process.
again boil down that pretty much post Napoleonic era through the eve of World War One as a battle between the national and the supranational, which is superior
Right.
for people to be governed under. And there's fair arguments for both. I find myself on both sides of the question very often, but point being is one side won out in the end, and we all know what that is.
Yeah, and you can make the argument, the just from a British perspective, how important fostering petty nationalism in Europe was, because it kept European powers that could threaten British supremacy in Europe uh, down. So um, that's an example, right? The divide and conquer example. That's what's happening in Ukraine. That is, I, I mean, our audience knows how far back this goes. The Romans and so on.
Yeah, it's a tale as old as statecraft itself. But with all that being said, I suppose we do have some news about the energy markets.
Yeah, yeah. Let's get to that.
So probably the funniest one I saw was within the course of no less than 24 hours, Bulgaria had affirmed that was going to go along with Russian oil and gas sanctions, before, again, within that like less than 24-hour period, recanting and saying we can't afford to cut off Russian oil and gas. You have Germany saying that we're done, we're not participating in the Russian energy markets. And then on the complete other side of both of those, you have Italy opening an account with the Gazprom affiliated bank to buy oil and gas in rubles. So you have all these things all over the place. You also have machinations in Russia where many are believing that soon the Russian economy will be pegged not only to gold but also commodities, where again the ruble is becoming a, let's just say, currency rooted in more, let's just say, tangible things, as it were, as opposed to many of these other currencies, which are just you could, I suppose you could say, are self-perpetuating at this point, but again, all backed up by the current global economic system. But point being is, you just have this complete level of inconsistency, not only among individual European nations, but also within individual European nations, where you've had Germany, which has flip flopped so many times. You had Bulgaria, which just did what it did, and Bulgaria has been a back and forth, a back and forth. We discussed them a little bit last episode. Really, the only European countries that have remained consistent, I believe actually the only one, is Serbia has been consistently pro-Russian, because even the UK, which has been this real anti-Russia stalwart, has, I believe, also been caught buying Russian oil and gas behind the scenes, as has
Yeah.
America. Um, uh, Poland has had their energy disputes with Russia, so have the Baltic states. But point being is, we must remind you, it's our civic duty to remind you, that not only NATO, but also the European Union have never been more united on anything in their entire history.
Incredibly united.
Incredibly
Incredibly.
united, complete cohesive plan of action, narrative, and plan going forward. It's, again, you've never seen this level of multinational cohesion at any point in history. And it's really important to hammer that home while you have all these European countries completely going their own way. Macron has been quiet since the election, so I don't know which side he's playing at the moment. But once again, Macron is another infamous flip flopper when it comes to these issues, where you had France not suspend economic cooperation with Russia, for example, when it came to auto manufacturing, and then again recant on the energy thing. Of course, Turkey is the eternal wild card. But point being is, within this grand anti-Russia strategy, once you get past the surface, there is no strategy to be found, and all you can really do at that is laugh. At least that's all I can do, which really shows you that even among the European elite, support for this little, let's just say, endeavor isn't a universal thing. Many of them are willing to defend their own personal interest over whatever the elites in Washington and Brussels are dictating. And even the elites in Washington and Brussels aren't necessarily in line with either each other or with themselves within their respective governing organizations, whether that be U.S. Congress, presidency, whatever, or European Parliament, or various European commissions, whatever. Point being is, none of these groups, the so-called United Western World that's standing up for freedom and democracy and against the tyranny of the evil Muscovites who are again going to storm off and impose Nazbolism on us all, or whatever the new narrative is. Uh, there's no coherent narrative either between these countries or within these countries themselves, including the ruling classes.
Right, and like many things during this war and the utterances of unity, really, the whole reason for them, I think, has been to morally support Ukraine and perpetuating this war as long as possible. Um, I think that's what it's for, and this day was coming. They were obviously not prepared. Maybe the only country that I know that has been strategic about this, and I only found this out in the last 48 hours, is Poland. Now, Poland, of course, had its gas shut off just like Bulgaria this Monday. So sorry, they were both shut off on Wednesday or Tuesday evening. of this week. This is Thursday that we're recording. People are going to hear this on
Friday.
Friday. So,
Friday,
just
Saturday,
very
actually.
recently, they've had their gas turned off. And of course, now they're forced to buy Russian gas at a higher price from the Germans. However, apparently, there is a pipeline that has not been in the news at all, except for some places in Europe, particularly Poland. And this pipeline is going to is stretching from Norway into Germany, and from there it will go into Poland. So uh, it's supposed to be completed, I think, by September or October of this year. I don't know when it'll go online, when it'll begin pumping gas, but it will probably be more like, I don't know, November, December, January. Um, is it going to be enough? I don't know. I mean, I think Europe is at a point right now where it has made this a moral cause. And if they are 10% less dependent on Russian gas in 2023 than they were in 2022, then that will be hailed as a victory. Um,
And naturally,
be that
depending
it,
on how far you want to go with this, it does play into the so-called Great Reset narrative, where it does really crush the economic situation of the average European and even average American at that point, in order to rebuild the economy to be much more optimized for them, so to speak, and get even away from this whatever remnants of the 20th century self-sufficient industrial economy that these countries may have had left, even in just small pieces.
right. And you brought up Macron, and I forgot to mention this. I mean, I said last on the last show that Macron is going to inherit this much poorer Europe as the so-called unofficial but de facto leader of the European Union, in a sense, right? I don't mean that literally, but um, I I wonder if he's happy with this. I wonder if he's happy with a Germany that is going to be far poorer and is going to lose its industrial capacity. I think in many ways he would want that to happen. What he has to do, of course, is he has to convince the French public that it's okay to be poor, and even even if the reason for that is Germany getting poorer. That's his task. I don't know, and I don't believe he's going to succeed in that. Uh, but you know, all these states continue to elect left of centrist politicians that are very much elites, and they're not willing to rock the boat, no matter how much they complain. When it comes to voting, you know, they vote them back in. Well, I mean, they will have to face the consequences then.
Yeah, even though I do think there's a fair case to be made, especially after watching what we did in November 2020. Just how popular are these elected officials, and how legitimate
Right.
is their claim to power? But point being is, whether it's because of their own error and folly that these people keep on coming into power, or whether because it's imposed on them, it should be shown that within the electoral realm, at least, there isn't a light at the end of the tunnel, and that, of course, I'm not advocating anything that would be illegal or immoral or anything like that, but there would have to be alternative solutions taken by the peoples of these nations in order to break free of this, let's just say, current regime, as it were. Now, again, whatever method that may take, that's completely on you. I don't live in any of these countries, uh, so I really can't advise you both from a principled perspective or a practical perspective. I have no solid advice for you on that front. But point being is, I think we've come to reiterate this for every show since about episode 200 and probably even a few before, that Europe is solidly under the thumb of the American Empire. And unless there's some sort of major shakeup, and one would have thought a Russo Ukrainian war may have been that major shakeup, it's going to stay that way for the foreseeable future. And I imagine it had to take a much more internal crisis for the American Empire in order to really wiggle their way out from under the American Empire's thumb. But again, time will tell with that. Or perhaps it'll just be the own internal contradictions within Europe where again, there's really no unity, there's really no unified plan of action, as it were, really no common narrative. Perhaps that could also be a way out of this. But again, that is all speculation insofar as that's concerned. And unless you have anything else on Europe, I just have one last story for today.
Sure. No, I don't have anything else on
So,
Europe.
in his infinite wisdom and let's just say infinite intelligence as well, our greatest and dearest President Biden has appointed somebody to be in charge of combating misinformation. So the White House has a new lackey, Nina Yankovitz, I believe is how you pronounce the name. It's now when I heard the name at first, I felt compelled to make the joke, and I did that. Well, naturally, she must have a very long nose. She must be part of. She must be one of those people. But upon further examination, I think she's just a shitlib Polish diaspora, which is also very fitting for what you would expect from a Democratic administration. These, let's just say, um, the respective Uncle Toms of these ethnic immigrant communities that really sell out what you know their parents, their grandparents stood for, and even their great grandparents or however many back, especially when you go to the old country, completely unrecognizable to that. So, of course, you have her. Her claims to fame are writing a guide on how to combat misinformation and how to deal with the harassment that women face online. So we have a very serious individual here entering into the Biden White House, and already she was complaining about being mocked on Twitter, being again the chief of disinformation. Now you'll notice that she got her appointment shortly after the shakeup in ownership and administration on Twitter. Now whether those two things are related, it's beyond me. I would imagine there's some tangential relation, but I don't think. Again, I know we were just talking up Twitter the other day and how Musk's buyout might be a, let's just say, at least marginally beneficial thing to us. I don't think that would have been something for that. But again, after the past 2 years, especially with the COVID crisis, with the outbreak of this war, with the so-called, let's just say, underhandedness about the 2020 election, it's no surprise they would pull somebody out like this out. However, this got surprisingly little media play. I saw a few things about it. Most of what I saw about it, and this could just be selection bias, was people mocking it. But it just seems like a token gesture so they can say that they're fighting against misinformation in this critical time. But I figured it was worth mentioning just to, uh, you know, fulfill a primary purpose of the show, which is to just chip away at the legitimacy of the regime, just pointing out how absurd it is, and once again, them adding on yet a new. I don't even think it's an official cabinet department, but a new talking head for the White House in order to lecture us about how, hey, your gas prices, that's not our fault. That's Putler's fault. But you see, by paying those prices, you're actually helping the brave Ukrainian freedom fighters uh, push back to the gates of Moscow and defeat our greatest rival, and put Putin on trial for war crimes or whatever the hell the narrative is nowadays. I think I'm blending both shitlib and Ukrainian nationalist narratives, which I suppose is fitting, given the past 2 months or so. But with that all being set aside, it's just I don't even know what the practical purpose of this was. Who is this appeasing? Who really cares about this beyond a handful of liberal elites? And again, these liberal elites, they are self-serving. I don't deny any of that. But you figure, at least when they do things like this, there is some greater purpose being served, even just to their own end. But I don't even see that happening now. From what I've seen, this has just been something that's either been overlooked by the general public or mocked and scorned by the people it's supposed to be targeted at.
Yeah, I've seen her before. I've seen her in the last 2 years pop up on CSIS and on the Atlanta Council. So it was strange to see her once again. She reminds me of that woman Baerbock, who became leader of the Green Party, and now she's in Scholz's administration. She had this, I mean, for Atlanta Council. standards of a long interview. I believe it was over 30 minutes with Anthony Blinken. And as soon as you see that, as soon as you see any of these people pop up on CSIS or the Atlantic Council, know that they are part of like the agenda that is coming down in the next year or two. That right away, right away. Um, so she is somebody who's been politically groomed for this position for a long time, and works closely with. I'm very sure with the CIA and the Endowment for Democracy and all those other organizations that are there to basically conceal the CIA. But that's the group she belongs to. She's young, she's under 40, she's pretty, and it goes along, of course, with this new, very female centric um, form of governance. Everything comes down to danger. She recently gave um, a small interview, and she was talking about like online safety. I mean, this is basically people crying murder because somebody mocked them on Twitter, right? But you understand just like
And
what
once
kind of
again, remember, whenever these people talk about fear and anguish, they actually mean they're disgusted and scorning you.
yes, yes, absolutely. But it also, I think, indicates the kind that we are living in this enormous transitional period, right? Because the system was never like this. It could always handle criticism, right? It cannot do it anymore. It has become brittle and therefore fragile. Um, I would guess that is because we're in a transition, and that once this is established, I don't know whether this trend will continue. They definitely want a generation that passes away that was problematic, you know, to essentially disappear, and they want the up and coming generation to have their points of view echoed, like so many of the millennials.
Yes, and just remember, free speech is only allowed, much like voting, when it won't make a difference. When they start to crack down on it, I'm not saying you're on the verge of some great breakthrough, but it does show that you have hit a nerve when they start to crack down, whether that be through private or state means. And that's the same thing with the election of candidates, for example, with Trump, even though you can question the Trump phenomenon, how much of controlled opposition he was. But point being is, methods of so called dissent are allowed when the regime does not believe that they are a substantial threat, which is, a large reason I think that we're still able to do this show on YouTube, honestly. I'll say that outright. I think we're that small that, you know, we're not perceived as a threat to anyone of any importance. So that's the reason we're allowed to get on here and prattle off every week or so about our great opinions on these subjects. Which we do thank you all for tuning in, and we are working on alternatives. I have put the link to the BitChute channel. I can throw that out there again so you guys can check that out. That would be our primary backup. But again, we got a few other things in the works, but that's aside the point. But point being is, I mean, someone like Yankowitz, getting back on topic, is really that new generation that is going to be in charge of the empire, and it is unprecedented to the point where, again, it's these, let's just say, grievance groups, whether it's like these women or LGBTQ CIA or Hispanic activist or black activist or whatever, any of these people that they can point to that isn't the, let's just say, traditional white male ruling class. And this, just as an aside, I saw a thing where I think, I can't remember, some mainstream media outlet was complaining that airline pilots were too white and too male, as if diversity
Yeah.
in the cockpit is the most important thing when it comes to flying these massive tubes full of hundreds of people across the world, and yeah, I suppose we just need a bunch of JFK juniors who are just given a rubber stamp through flight school so they can try to land their planes without knowing how to use the instruments. But that's aside the point. But once again, it's getting at that where they have to have this so-called internal revolution in who are actually the movers and shakers of this regime. And it's going to be the insufferable people like Yankwitz, and I suppose they're just as determined to make this as at least painful as possible for people like us going forward. But point being is, I don't think Yankwitz being put in charge of a let's just say position to combat misinformation, disinformation is that big of a deal. But I do think it's very symbolically important, so to speak.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree.
But that is all I had for this episode, unless you have anything to tag on to the tail end of this.
No, no, that's about it for me.
Well, thank you everyone for tuning into this much shorter episode of the War Report. We will see you all next time we record, and until then, goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.